who is going to help me come to questions about my own authenticity? Unless I'm willing to let reality correct me and correct the world I participate in, right?
Yep.
Then I'm living a sham. Yep. And I think what it is to be free is to refuse to live a sham life.
Dr. James Madden is professor of philosophy at Benedictine College. He has taught courses in modern philosophy, metaphysics, and philosophy of religion for over 20 years, and his research has included phenomenology, philosophy of mind, analytic philosophy, and cognitive science. Listen in as we discuss his latest book entitled Thinking About Thinking, Mind and Meaning in the Era of Techno-Nihilism. Benedictine College is transforming culture in America, one conversation at a time. From our studios in Atchison, Kansas, these are the Benedictine Dialogues. All right, Jim, welcome to the Benedictine Dialogues,
Thank you, man. Thank you.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation. We've kind of talked about this book a couple of times before you even published it, talked about some of the concepts, but finally getting an opportunity to dive in and just really looking forward to asking you some questions and diving in for our audience. So one of the first questions I want to ask, especially with a newly published book, is what was the impetus behind it? What was your motivation behind writing this book?
Yeah, for me, it was sort of maybe 2/3 career. I returned a lot of the kind of material that I was very interested in when I was an undergraduate. Okay, so I went off to grad school planning to work in European philosophy and phenomenology. For various reasons, I got into analytic philosophy and then wrote a master's thesis on Ludwig Wittgenstein and Wilfrid Sellars, which when you have read the book, that makes sense. And then I went on to my doctoral program, and for various reasons, it wasn't going to work out to work on that stuff, so I ended up going a different direction into early modern philosophy, and then eventually I get a tenure track position here at Benedictine, teach a lot of Aquinas, so then I go in that direction. I write my first book on Aquinas' philosophy of mind, and philosophy of mind was what I always wanted to do anyway. And then finally I get to a point in my career where I have the leisure to like kind of do whatever I want, okay? And I started going back and rereading a lot of this stuff that I was into when I was an undergrad that I originally wanted to do in grad school. You know, people like Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Wittgenstein, and then this book is the product of that like return to my youth.
Nice.
Right, in many ways,
Yeah. Well, maybe just to kind of start off the conversation, give us a little bit of a synopsis of the idea of the philosophy of mind. You know, maybe some of our audience doesn't know quite that concept, and I think it's an important concept before we dive in.
Yeah. So, you know, the philosophy of mind obviously is the attempt to give the broadest possible account we can of what it is to have a mind, okay? And of course, right off the bat, that raises the most important question in philosophy of mind, like what is a mind, okay? And the tendency, and maybe the most common tendency in philosophy of mind, is to think of the question of what is a mind in terms of the mind-body problem. Okay, so we have a sense that we have mental states or we have a mental life, right? That we like to characterize, call it a mind or a self or a soul. And the question then becomes like, what is the relationship between the mind or the self and the soul to the body? Okay. And the overriding concern there is how would those two things interact if they're not the same thing, right? And there's the questions about dualism versus materialism, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And that's how philosophy of mind is played out in the mainstream of Anglo-American philosophy and even to some degree in Catholic philosophy too, all right? And that's well and good, right? And I've spent a lot of time on those kind of questions. In this book though, I've looked at a different kind of question in the philosophy of mind, and it less so the question of what is it? What kind of entity is it? Right? Is it more like a ghost or more like, you know, an animal? Right? And instead, I've asked more just what do we mean when we say someone has a mind? Okay, in that sense of like, if you said, you know, Madden was a little odd today, he must have lost his mind. Okay, you're not asking whether there's like a ghost occupying this gorilla, right? You're asking, you're making a point about whether or not what I do makes sense. Yeah. Okay. And so then for me, the question in this book is, okay, what is a mind? But I mean more in the sense of what is it to be the kind of thing that makes sense of things? Like what is it to be a sense-making being? Okay. And traditionally we'd say that would be, what is it to be a thinker?
Yes.
Okay. And ergo the title, Thinking About Thinking. So,
Yes.
so the question for this book isn't necessarily, is the mind something separate from a body, though that comes up. The question is, what are the conditions such that we can think the way we humans think? What are those conditions?
Yeah, very good. And you start off with kind of opposition in a way towards the materialist perspective with the picture of a brain. And you go through this really interesting narrative of if the brain at that moment is thinking about Paris, how can we actually say, that that's a mind or that that's participating in mind or whatever that might be, but maybe dive into a little bit of that of like, if someone was to take, answer a materialist and take a picture of a brain at an exact moment where neurons are acting in this way through this pathway, and this is what's causing thoughts, right? But you kind of answer that.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, so the origin of that was actually literally when my wife was still teaching psychology here at the college. There was this, caption on a photograph in the psychology textbook that she was using that was an image of an fMRI, and under the caption said something, it was, here's a picture of a mind. Okay, so it's an image of a brain and it's claimed to be a picture of a mind, okay? And I remember laughing aloud at that, saying, it's the most absurd thing I've ever heard, because minds aren't the kinds of things you can take pictures of, okay? So why not, all right? Well, I think what we mean when someone says, okay, I can show you a picture of someone's mind by showing a picture of their brain, is what you're saying is the mind and the brain are the exact same thing, okay? In the way that if we said, Jim is Jennifer's husband, right? When you got to Jim and you got to Jennifer's husband, you wouldn't count twice, you would just count once. It's just this dude in the chair here, okay? And so I think when people say something like, well, I can take a picture of a mind by taking a picture of a brain, they're saying they're identical. They're the one and the same thing. Okay. If that's the case, then it should be anytime you have that brain, you would have that mind, right? That brain should be a sufficient condition, we say in philosophy, for the occurrence of that mind, right? Or at least the brain in that state, okay? So as I do in the book, let's suppose you have a human being, we'll call him Cormac, okay? And Cormac is thinking about Paris. Right? So his mind is in a state such that it's ordered towards or looking to or contemplating the city of Paris, okay? And then say we put him on an fMRI and we get an image of his brain in that state, okay? Is that a picture of the thought of Paris, okay? The case I make in the book is it clearly isn't, right? For this reason, Cormac could be in that neural state, right? His brain could be in that state, and yet the city of Paris might not exist, okay? He could be in that state, right? And like the example I use in the book is like you could have a caveman who by some, odd circumstance gets a head injury such that suddenly he's in this state, neurological state, right? Just like Cormac's current state, before Paris even existed, okay? I find it very hard to believe that you would say that's a thought about Paris, okay? So what that tells you then is maybe in order for Cormac to think about Paris, the brain state must occur, it's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. Something else has to be present, right? Besides just the brain, right? The brain might be necessary, but not sufficient, okay? And I think the missing ingredient there is we have to admit that at least among the extra ingredients, you need the city of Paris. You need something outside of Cormac that is Paris, that he can be ordered towards in his thought, okay? And that's a very important move for me in the book, because now what we've just said is the conditions of our thinking aren't just what's in our head or in our mind, our individual mind, but they're conditions that have to be met outside of us in a broader world, right? So if Cormac were not in a world that makes him be involved in one way or another with the city of Paris, he would not have thoughts about Paris, okay? So now we're on our way to taking thought and not make it localizable to a brain or even an individuated soul, and we're smearing it out across the world.
Yeah. It's a participation in a larger community as well as an environment, right? Because even if it was just the introduction of the idea of Paris, let's say somebody gave him a really good story about a town named Paris where these things happened, at least the idea pre-existed prior to him actually thinking about it. And even a storyteller often has these pre-existing ideas that come into their storytelling, right? So in a way, you even mentioned the term of like maybe mind is either a combination of or leans one way or the other towards inside out versus outside in influence.
Right. A great way to think about this is I've never been to Paris. Okay, I've never been there. I think I have thoughts about Paris. Well, how is it possible for me to have thoughts about Paris, right? Maybe my friend Jared has been there, right? I've read books written by people who have been to Paris, right? The English language has vocabulary that refers to Paris, all these things. So my ability to refer to Paris, to have a thought about Paris, is piggybacking on this vast community of other human beings that I live with, right? That I'm with, okay? And so there, it would seem then mind is coming from outside in, not inside out, right? I would not have thoughts about Paris if I were not involved in that community, right? And if you think of it like this reaches deep back into our history, right? So if, as I put in the book, if Charles Martel hadn't won a battle, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there's probably no city of Paris. And thereby, I'm not thinking about it, nor are you, nor is anyone, or we're thinking about it very differently. And so once again, the conditions of our thought are not just in us, they're in the histories that we inherit.
Yeah. Maybe we're thinking more like Carthage at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
The salted fields.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So from there, then, it's an interesting perspective of mind, especially because as atheists tend to claim, things always boil down just to the neurons or whatever, and maybe there's a case in regard to actions versus thoughts in that regard, and I'm sure we'll get into that later on. But I love the idea of mind being something that you're participating in, that we're all participating in something larger than ourselves. So in that chapter, I think it's your second chapter, you get into the idea of mind as participation. Maybe dive into that a little bit.
Sure. So let's suppose I've managed to convince you that mind is inside out, not outside in, or outside in, not inside out, right? Then the question then will come, okay, what are the conditions that are necessary for us to then have a mind? Like, what do we have to participate in outside of ourselves such that we end up with a mind? Or I would rather even put it now, not that I have a mind, but I participate in mind, right? Because the case I'm making is there is no mind held by the solitary individual. It's always a participation in a broader set of structures. So then we can enumerate a lot of different kind of structures that have to be there, okay? The first one, I think, that we would want to discuss is, so going back to the example we used earlier, if you said Madden seemed to have lost his mind today, okay? And then I asked you to unpack that, right? Probably where we would go in a hurry there is you would say, well, he quit making sense, okay? And then as we unpack that, I think what we would end up with is he wasn't able to give reasons that anyone else could recognize for either what he was doing or what he was saying, okay? And so I think the first thing that we look for when we say someone has met the conditions for participating in mind is they can give reasons for what they do and what they say that other beings participating in mind can recognize as reasons, okay? So step one for participation is we have to be initiated into a practice of giving and taking reasons for our sayings and doings, our thinkings and doings, okay? And so I think of that presupposes that we have a language, right? That we have a shared vocabulary in that language, okay? It also presupposes that we're in touch with the world in a physical way too, right? Or at least an empirical way. The example I give in the book is if Cormac can't distinguish between a city and a lake, okay, and he might as well mean Lake Michigan by Paris rather than a city in France by Paris, then he doesn't really know how to use the word Paris and thereby doesn't know how to give reasons for what he says about Paris. Okay, now it's important because what counts for a city or what counts for a lake is a moving target empirically, right? There's all sorts of different conditions That it would be very hard to like neatly define that in a way that actually carries over to our practice, okay? So that means our giving and taking of reasons is sensitive to what's going on in the world empirically, okay? If I can just define cup abstractly, that's not good enough unless if you tell me to find the cup, Jim, I can't go find one, right? But good luck coming up with a really tight definition of a cup, right? So this presupposes that we're in touch with the world empirically, okay? It's not just a formal logic, but a material logic is the fancy way to put that, okay? So we have to be in a space of reasons. Okay, another important thing that'll come up here is in the psychological empirical work on this is really incredible, is we now know that, and this gets into some of the stuff with technology that I deal with in the book too, that the primary condition for human beings learning a language is emotional attachment with other human beings, okay? Like literally we learn our language at our mother's knee, okay? So if language is a condition for thinking, and now emotional attachment is clearly a condition for language, so it seems like we have to participate not just in reasons giving, but also care and concern with other human beings. Okay, we have to be, and so and it's that care bond, right? And there's evidence that shows that care bond is necessary, or at least contributes to thought throughout your whole life, right? The more one is accepted in a community, the more they're able to participate in reasons giving, okay? Right? And so I think emotional attachments can be a big part of this, right? Some of the really fascinating stuff that I got into in the research for the book is we as human beings tend to think of ourselves, especially American human beings, Western human beings, like we tend to think of ourselves as these radical individuals, right? Okay, and we think what makes us distinctive, what's really distinctive about human beings is that we can go on our own and we don't have to conform, right? And the actual empirical research would tell you nothing could be further from the truth, okay? And we probably don't run the planet because we're really good individualists. We actually run it because we're actually really good conformists, okay? One of my favorite examples of this, it comes from, it's cited by a psychologist named von Hippel, and he talks about a very well confirmed experiment in behavioral psychology, where if you take a human child and a chimpanzee at about the same cognitive level, and we all had that stage, right? And you take a treat and you hide it in a box, okay? And let's say there's holes in the top of the box, and you go through a sequence of poking the holes to unlock the box, okay? And you do that for both the chimpanzee and the human child. Do it several times. The human child will pick up on it, okay? Do it several times, the chimpanzee will pick up on it, okay? Fair enough, right? Now vary it so that the boxes are transparent and it's obvious where the lock is, okay? Go through the sequence, right? Human child will go through the sequence, even though it's obvious where the lock is. The chimpanzee will go right to that lock and unlock that thing and get the treat, okay? The point being is humans tend to conform to what they're told by authorities, okay? The phrase is, it's hard to herd cats, it's not hard to herd humans, right, okay? Because it's actually surprisingly easy to herd us, right, as much as we don't like to think this. Well, why is that? It's because to give reasons, to do the human thing, to have a human mind, presupposes a long education that's like unprecedented in the animal kingdom, okay? We cannot do what we do without extensive cultural knowledge, right? Without extensive education, right? The idea that you're gonna have a 12 or 13-year childhood among most animals is absurd, and now we drag it out to like 30 now, right? Okay, our education. Well, that education can only work if I'm willing to like shut up and listen to somebody, okay? And also many of the social practices that like distinguish us presuppose a willingness to conform. Like I don't want you to have like an existential crisis at a four-way stop, right? We have to cooperate, okay? So think of it then, if you aren't in an environment where you can trust the people around you to teach you, okay? If you're in a traumatic environment, right? You will not learn the conditions of human-mindedness, right? And once again, like the association between traumatic relationships and further down cognitive problems are pretty clear, okay? So here's the point, it's like, once again, you have to have emotional bonding and trust for people around you if you're going to have a distinctively human mind up and running.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Finally, it's very clear too that our thinking is tied to our ability to skillfully manipulate things really with our hands. Okay. Even the most gifted mathematician at some point is going to pull out the pencil and paper to have to figure it out, in a way that they can visualize and they can work with their hands, right? All of our skills, even the most abstract, begin by being taught with how to do something, right? How to do something physically in the world, right? And once again, if you haven't been taught these skills, right, at some point you're going to have a truncated, experience of mindedness.
Yeah. And potentially destroy the thing you're trying to build.
Exactly.
Right? Because you don't know the language that it's speaking to you.
Exactly.
Right? It reminds me of Hans Georg Gadamer's idea of fusion of horizons, right? That you have the researcher and you have the person that's the student, that both of them need to have the mindedness to look up. And by doing so, you're actually seeing what's in front of you ever more clear. Right. But what I love about what you're saying is, especially because it's almost a really interesting way of combating relativism, that based on neuroscience, psychology, evolutionary theory, so much of that is pointing towards there's something else here. We need the love and care of each other. We need participation in a community, a larger cultural expression of what we mean by mindedness. That it points away from just the moral argument, but also just a thinking argument against relativism. Yeah,
these things that we associate with emotional attachment, family, these structures are not accidental to mindedness.
Yeah.
Right. And they play an important evolutionary role, right? They're there for a reason, right? They're
not
what
just
we've
survival.
been, not just survival. Yeah, or really, I might put it this way: our survival is contingent on these structures.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So it is not just a late cultural choice that we have these things.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. That's awesome. So the next thing I'd love to get into is you do this really great chapter on some of the recent findings of neuroscience and the idea of free will. Maybe share some of those kind of recent findings and what that has to say about our understanding of free will.
Sure. Okay, so now if you look at debates about free will, a lot of them are like looking at some fairly interesting, cutting edge neuroscience. Okay. And there's some citations in the book, right? And so it is very clear that there are locations, is a crass way to put it, but there are locations in the brain where our experience of free will is grounded. Okay, there's no getting around that. Okay, so whatever we're doing when we feel like we're choosing freely, there's something correlated to that in the brain. Okay. The most famous piece in this is an experiment that was done by a guy named Benjamin Libet, okay, who was building on earlier work done by a couple of German neuroscientists, Dickey and Kornhuber, okay. And what the initial work discovered is, if I'm asked, let's say, I forget what the exact thing they did is if I'm asked to say I'm tapping at a certain rate, and you ask me to stop tapping whenever I choose, okay. Dickey and Kornhuber discovered that there is, in fact, a neurophysiological event that's associated with that, okay. And that was like that was the first time somebody really, where they could see choice as anticipated in neurophysiology, okay. Libet comes along and he does an experiment through very complicated means, and he finds out that neurophysiological event happens before you have a sense of having chosen. Okay, so the neurophysiological event occurs, and then you feel like you made a decision as to when you would stop tapping. Okay, so it looks like then the conscious aspect has nothing to do with the choice. It's all done at the level of unconscious physical processes. Okay, and a lot of people heard that and said, well, free will's done, right? Because the will, if you think of the will as something that we consciously enact, right? That would seem to play no role in causing when I decide to stop tapping my finger, okay? Not Libet's view, okay? Libet had a very subtle view about this, but the way this has been taken up by philosophers and some scientists, that was the point, okay? All right, so in the book, I don't want to. I'm not going to attempt to correct the science. Okay, so I just take this as a given. Okay, so it does seem that there's a neurophysiological event that occurs before I consciously decide to stop tapping. Okay, and my reply to that in the book is a great big so what.
Yeah.
Okay, because I think that has nothing to do with something like a significant human action. Okay, because if you ask me if I'm tapping at a certain rate, and you ask me, Jim, why did you change the rate of your tapping? Why did you stop tapping? I would have no answer for you. It is utterly random, okay? I can't give reasons for it. And if I can't give reasons for it, it's not a minded human act. I think that what we've done earlier, okay? And so for me, a lot of like what you see is so-called the threat to human ethical agency by neuroscience is a non-starter, because most of what these experiments are talking about aren't the kind of actions that I think are the sort of actions that we're really worried about, right? They're not actions that we can give reasons for. They're not actions that matter to us. They're not actions that define us, right? And what do we really want out of our actions? What do we really want out of human freedom, right? We want actions that matter to us, actions that we can give reasons for, actions that we take responsibility for, not just random choices.
How do we navigate the seemingly competitive claims of faith in science? When it comes to creation, some people have this legitimate concern: if life evolved, does that mean God's not necessary? Dr. Ramage, if we no longer accept the ancient cosmology, how do we know anything's true anymore? Atheists and Christians alike tend to unite in seeing the Bible and science as mutually contradictory. But the Catholic Church actually thinks quite differently, that from the very beginning, God has been perceived in the things that were made. How do God and creatures work together? What is the relationship of creation, God, the history of life? And what does knowing the created world reveal about God? I'm Dr. Matthew Ramage, full professor of theology here at Benedictine College, and this is Faith in Science.
When I was reading that chapter, something I was thinking about, and maybe this is a kind of a remedial question, but also, I mean, I've looked into a lot of the science of addiction.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of science backing the idea of neuroplasticity, right? That you, through conscious effort, can start to create new neural pathways for things like dopamine and stuff like that.
Right.
That your brain functions in a way towards something higher of what you're talking about. Like there's a reason for what I'm trying to either stop or trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
If I'm trying to start a new habit, I need to do these things on a very consistent basis so that it almost becomes the tapping thing, right? So that now that pathway is created so that whatever that antecedent was doesn't matter, because the reasons are I want to accomplish A or I want to accomplish B, right?
Yeah. And you know, and I agree. An important thing in terms of the book to bring out here is, now keep in mind that before this chapter, I've argued that mind is out there, right? And we share it, okay? And so I try to make the case in the book that for a lot of our most important decisions we make in our lives, the reasons for those decisions are not fully occurrent to us when they're made, that we're piggybacking on the reasons that are in our world, okay? So I use the example of my decision to marry, okay? I'm not sure I fully understood the reasons for that, right, at that time. I do far better now, because I'm a better practitioner of the world that I live in, right? I'm okay. But I think at the time, that decision piggybacked to a much higher degree on the family I was raised in, the church I belonged to, you know, similar conditions for my wife, the friendships I had, right? Just the general drift of human life, all those things, right? Were doing the thinking for me, I think.
Yes.
Okay, right? I still think that's a perfectly free decision because reasons can be given for it. But those reasons were not fully occurrent to me as an individual, if they are at all, or ever will be fully occurrent to me as an individual, until well after the fact. I understand it better now, over 20 years later, right? But at the time, I think I was surfing on the reasons in my environment, in
Yeah.
my Lebenswelt, if
Yeah.
that makes sense, okay? But so no, then I don't care who goes first, the will or the brain event,
Yeah.
right? Because my understanding of the event might not even happen until 20 years after the fact, right?
Yeah. Isn't that where you get kind of into the space of reasons versus the space of causes?
Yes.
Maybe go on a little bit to that.
Yeah, so there's two ways we can explain somebody's activity, right? This is the example I use in the book, is like if we say Smitty believes that there's a multiverse because he's been reading the astrophysics literature, okay? Or we say Smitty believes in the multiverse because he's been drinking cough syrup all morning, okay? In the one case, what we're doing is we're ascribing to Smitty a place in the space of reasons, right? Like if we asked him, he could give an explanation for his belief in terms of evidence, in that evidence's relationship to the belief, okay? In the other case, we're giving an explanation of Smitty in terms of subconscious physical causation, right? There's a lot of cough syrup in his nervous system now, okay? And no, in both cases, the belief could be true, okay? But the question is whether or not Smitty has a normative relation to it or a merely causal relation to it, right? Okay. Now where that crosses over becomes very difficult, right? Okay. But the thing is I think we assume that just because there's a causal story to be told, that undermines the normative story, okay? And that's one of the things I'm trying to diffuse in the book.
Yeah. And from there, you kind of get into the idea of mental freedom itself.
Yeah.
You know, what does that actually mean? And you actually tie it to certain responsibilities. You tie it
Right.
to certain conclusions, or at least commitments
Right.
in there. So you have this threefold idea of freedom and responsibility.
Yeah.
Maybe get a little bit into that.
Sure. Okay, so I argue that there are three conditions for legitimate bona fide human freedom, okay? And so keep in mind, for the most part, whether we like it or not, we mostly kind of sleepwalk through our lives, right? We do what they tell us. We do what they say, right? And I hope we do, because otherwise, once again, I don't want to deal with you at a four-way stop unless you're a pretty good conformer, okay? And so for the most part, we do what we're told, right? Okay, but at some point, it seems that what freedom demands is that we do more than that.
Yeah.
Okay, we take responsibility. We don't just do what we're told, but we take responsibility for what we're doing.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think there's three conditions for that. The first thing is I have to be responsible to the world I've inherited. So it's my responsibility to that set of participations that I've inherited. Okay, so at some point I should be able to tell you, using the marriage example. Okay, let's marriage example for a Roman Catholic. Okay, at some point I should be able to tell you, like, what are the goods that are promised by marriage, right? What are the practices that are promised that marriage commits me to? Like, I should become educated so that I can make explicit, right, the participations that I have.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think if one never rises to that level, one has probably never risen to the level of freedom. Okay, so that's one condition. So I have to not just be conforming, and I also have to not be just making it up, right? I have to know what I'm doing, right? What is it that I've been told, and what are these things, right? Can I explain them? Okay. But then at some point, I think I have to not just be responsible to the world I've inherited, but I have to hold that world responsible to reality.
Yeah.
Okay. Being in a cult is not being free. Okay. And if I never ask critical questions about the world that I've been thrown into, then I'm living by accident. Like, if this is a good thing I'm doing, I'm just lucky. If it's a bad thing I'm doing, I'm just unlucky, right? And a free being doesn't live by luck alone, right? A free being lives by reasons. So at some point, I'm going to have to ask critical questions about the world that I've inherited. Okay. And then finally, think of it this way: is I could know, using the marriage example, I could know very well what the teachings about marriage are, and I can know the goods of it, right? And I could explain all that. I could be convinced that in fact is the truth of the matter, okay? But yet, that might not be what motivates me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, maybe deep down inside, I'm motivated by lust or greed or, social status or something like that, okay? And so then if things worked out, I'm still just lucky then.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not living by my reasons anymore, right? So I have to ask myself kind of some dark questions about like, what's my own real inner motive for doing this? Am I actually motivated because this is good and true and these are the right things, or do I have something else going on behind the scenes, right? And that's sort of like where I have like a constructive piece with Nietzsche in the book, right? He's right to ask us those dark questions when Nietzsche says, the knower is least well known to himself, right? Yeah, so I better get to the bottom of myself if I'm actually going to be a free being. Right? What really does motivate me?
Which often associates with certain anxiety. Right? Because in a way, because knowing the self is so darn difficult, and it takes time to mine through that there might be some darkness in there, and you're probably a little bit afraid of what that is. Or it might be something that you're so unaware of what's going on in your own life, in your own mind, or if you will, your motivations, you don't know sometimes, right? That all of a sudden you're surprised by, I'm that kind of a person. Yeah, that's not good.
And so and there's going to be, with all three levels of freedom, there's going to be some kind of anxiety associated with it, right? Especially once you get to that second level, like, well, is this true anyway? Okay, so it could be that I was thrown into the wrong thing. Yeah, that is going to it should cause you some anxiousness. That shows that because unless I'm willing to let reality correct me and correct the world I participate in, right? Then I'm living a sham. And I think what it is to be free is to refuse to live a sham life, right? So yeah, there will be anxiousness when I ask, is the world I've inherited even true, right? And then even deeper anxiousness. Yeah, but what if, even if it's true, what if I'm just lousy, right? And that's not really what motivates. I'm motivated by this because fill in the blank, and there's all sorts of fills in the blank, right? And this once again brings us back to community questions, right? Because who is going to help me come to questions about my own authenticity? It seems like, the best person to do that for me is my wife, right? The example I use in the book is like, she might tell me, we know you opposed, Smitty's promotion simply because you're jealous of his work, not because of the reasons you gave, right? I mean, it's because I have trusted friends, I have trusted confidants, right? Guys like Jared here, right? Who will tell me, I think you're lying to yourself, right? So once again, that project of that third level of freedom, that authenticity, can only really be completed among trusted friends who are going to be willing to correct you.
Love that.
And
I think I've mentioned
this. And it's never done then.
And I think I've mentioned this in a previous episode too. It always reminds me of Bruce Lee when he talked about he knows himself more after fighting someone else. Because he realizes his actions and his presuppositions, that it's less about the enemy in front of him and more about his inner mining. But he needs the other person, to work with, to fight with.
Aristotle's a man alone is a beast or a god.
Yes, exactly. And speaking of Aristotle, you also mentioned his idea of ignorance. Right, as kind of like the worst slavishness that mankind can fall into, which requires that mining out of whatever it is that motivates us.
And I my own read, and I could be correct on this, but my own read on much of Greek philosophy we find in Plato and Aristotle is indeed taking up the challenge of the tragic poets, right? And using the example of Aeschylus with Oedipus the king. Is what was Oedipus's real problem, right? Oedipus's real problem was he didn't know himself, right? And he should have known better. He knew the prophecy against him. Some pretty obvious coincidences are going on here. We won't go into the details, right? Okay. He should have known better, and he did know better. He just wasn't willing to look inside as to what his real motives were. And that's what brings him to fate. So fate, the undermining of our freedom, has much to do with our unwillingness to ask critical questions of ourselves and our world, right? It's not surprising that Aeschylus has the word on, the revelation of Oedipus's sins come from the Oracle of Delphi, right? Where one was told to know thyself, right? What was Aeschylus' problem? He refused to know himself, right? And I read much of what goes on in the third book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics as a demand that we know ourselves, that we do not allow ourselves to be fall into the ignorance of an Oedipus.
And what happens to Oedipus, right? Ultimately, he becomes blind. He fulfills what he is.
Fulfills what he is.
And it's a self-inflicted wound. Because he didn't do the inner work, right?
The inner work. So here then I do appeal to people like Nietzsche and Freud and Jung, because I do think that inner work, there is a role for that. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the self-mining is what the best philosophers get into, right? How do I live my life?
Right.
In order to do that, you got to know what life is. You got to know what you are.
And what are my pitfalls?
Yes. So now with the last couple of minutes, and of course this could be a whole episode, I love your concept of what mankind is as an offloading being. We take what's in here and offload it into the world. And you mentioned it earlier, we work with our hands, we create things, we build things, and that's a reflection often of the cultural mind, or what you call the Geist, right? This larger thing that we're all participating in. And now with this introduction of new technology, such as AI, you really go deep into, is this thing an apocalyptic reality?
2 chapters in that, basically.
Yes. And the answer is yes in a certain way, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be dystopian. And it could be a mix of utopian, dystopian. Maybe kind of get in a little bit of that there.
Yeah, so one of the very common notions in contemporary cognitive science that I piggyback on in this book is the extended mind hypothesis, which was originally crafted by David Chalmers and Andy Clark. Okay, and Clark has really made it his thing. Okay, and the extended mind hypothesis makes the point that it doesn't really seem to matter whether I have writing outside of me that I'm using to recall, or there's writing in my nervous system I'm using to recall. Either way, it's a very similar relationship. Okay, so that becomes part of a case to say that the way human cognition works is to extend itself technologically into its environment. Like even language is a kind of technological extension of our cognition in the environment. Because I can talk to you, I can say, hey, Jared, remind me that we start at 10, not 11, right? And so what is that? That's my way of taking some of the burden of cognition and putting on my environment, which includes other people, okay? And so on this view, and I think it's right, there was no pre-technological human cognition. Like this is what, if we associate cognition with language, there was no pre-technological human cognition, right? It's always been taking the burden and spreading it out into an environment that we make for ourselves, okay? And so that we end up with things like cell phones, right? Seems to be it was baked in the cake from the beginning, right? I mean, that we were on a one-way trip to this, okay? And I think so probably, if this is my kind of read on history now, okay, is every generation, or maybe every epoch, has a sense of an end of the world. Because what's going to happen is our ways of rigging our environment for ourselves are going to become outmoded. Okay, so we're going to have a sense that we're coming to an end, right? And we are, right? But note that coming to an end has always had another beginning associated with it, right? But the problem is on this side of that, we can't know what that other beginning looks like. So it does cause us anxiety, right? But I think it's inevitable, like any apocalypse, right? Right. And I can be pretty moody and gloomy about it. And there's some moody and gloomy moments in that book. But also I think it's not something I can look forward to, but it's not something I can really rue either, because I don't claim to understand it, because it's going to be the next life world. Right.
It's also not something that you can stop. Right. It's a consistent, ongoing thing. But the way I kind of envisioned it was sort of like an explorer going on a journey. And it's the first time, let's say, Lewis and Clark are going over this huge mountain. They have no idea what's on the other side of that thing. And who knows what kind of technology that whatever on the other side of that thing has that's going to either enhance or hurt their life. It could annihilate them, or it could say, hey, check out this new technology. Okay, now we've got this new thing. Let's go over this river that much easier. Right?
And we can't know that on this side. Now, one thing that I do press hard in the book is the worry, though, is this technological revolution does seem to be having effects on our ability to have emotional attachment. It does seem to be having effects on our having real world tactile skills, et cetera, et cetera. And that I do worry about, because those are non-optional human evolutionary structures, right? Okay, evolutionary condition structures. And so I'm not, once again, I'm not a pessimist, I'm not an optimist either about technology. But I do think we have to watch very carefully that will the pre-rational conditions of our mindedness be undermined by this because of that loss of attachment, because of those loss of physical skills, because of those losses of being in touch with an empirical world, et cetera, et cetera. That's my worry.
Yes. You've got this great line in there from Heidegger that he does say, we are technology creating beings, therefore we should continue going forward.
Yeah.
However,
we have no choice, it's a destiny.
Yes. However, you have to be so careful about what it destroys about the rest of our beingness.
Yes.
Which is those things like affectivity, those things like cultural connection, all of that kind of stuff. And then one thing too that you get into a little bit is this idea of AI being able to be rational itself. And granted, I think that could be an entire episode.
Yeah, sure. We could do that too.
All by itself. Okay, we probably should actually. So if you want to give kind of like a Reader's Digest version of that, because that to me is the question that needs to be asked with this new technology.
And for the purpose of this book, I don't take a stand on whether or not AI can be rational. Right? So I actually say I'm not going to talk about artificial intelligence.
Right.
I'm going to talk about artificial mind. Artificial Geist is the German I use in the book. And I make a case is whatever AI is doing, it's not doing what we're doing. Okay, because our mindedness is grounded in emotional attachment, physical skills, right? And being in touch with a cultural world, et cetera, right? And our mindedness presupposes this sort of willingness to sort of like look at dark questions about ourselves and have anxiety, okay? So the AI chapter in the book is called The Anxiety of Not Being a Machine, okay? And I make the case is the fact that we find the question of whether we're machines as ridden with angst for us is the evidence that we need to see that we're not machines. Okay.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't mean AI won't become smarter than we are. Okay. I'm not taking a stance on that one way or another. Okay. But what I'm saying is whatever it is, it's not us because it's not subject to this kind of anxiety that we have about ourselves. And it's not subject to the same conditions of attachment and participation that we are in our mindedness.
Yeah, you get into sort of syntax versus semantics and things like that, and you have this really great kind of threefold thing again of
there's a structure running
that pragmatic versus the giving a damn and then the authenticity.
Yes.
I thought that was the perfect way of like this is why it's different, and what we're participating when we talk about mind, it will never participate in at least at its current state, right? If anything, it'll be artificial. And that's the scary part.
Exactly.
Because we want an authentic mind, right?
And I've given a lecture based on that chapter for the Thomistic Institute several times, right? And the way I title that lecture is I say, the problem with artificial intelligence isn't what you think, think underlined, okay? Because that's the track most people say is like humans have this special abstractive intelligence that a machine will never have, et cetera, et cetera. I take no stance on that. Okay, in the book at least, right? Okay, let's just say, suppose it can, right? It's still not what we do, because what we do is wrapped up in this Lebenswelt, this lived world, this world of attachment and anxiety. And that's what distinguishes us. And I think this is important though, because I think especially as philosophers, we tend to like say, okay, what human distinctiveness is like sort of rational, abstractive contemplation, right? But that has very little to do with the lives of most humans who have ever lived, right? Okay, that has very little to do with really, even as a professional philosopher, 90% of my day, right? What really matters to the most human beings that have ever lived is the people they love, the things that cause them anxiety, et cetera, right? And so I think there is a little bit of like a pushback of the tradition that I stand in here, right? Is to say, have we really, really hit what is most valuable in our lives, right? And do you see what I mean, right? Have we kind of missed what the human thing is because we've only looked in this one direction for it?
Yeah, that's fantastic, man. This has been such a great conversation, and
thank you.
For all of our listeners and viewers, I highly recommend picking up this book, especially if you have any interests in the philosophy of mind or AI or just good deep philosophy. It's a great book to pick up.
Sure.
So thanks again for coming on the show, man.
Been an honor,
this has been awesome,
and
really hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great day. We hope you enjoyed the Benedictine Dialogues, a production of Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. To catch all the latest and support our growing platform, visit media.benedictine.edu. And be sure to recommend this show to your friends and family. Help us to transform culture in America, one conversation at a time.